the first light of dawn, was breaking over the English Channel when Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt stood on the deck of a landing craft, watching the French coastline emerge from the darkness. Around him, 4963 Canadian soldiers were crammed into assault boats, heading toward the beaches of Dieppe. Most of them were so young they'd never seen combat. In 6 hours, 3367 of them would be dead, wounded, or prisoners of war. And the officers who planned this operation already knew it was going to be a disaster. This is the story of Operation Jubilee, the Dieppe Raid, one of the most controversial and catastrophic operations of World War II, a raid that was supposed to last a few hours and boost Allied morale. A raid that turned into a bloodbath so horrific that questions are still being asked today. Was it really a reconnaissance mission for D-Day? Or was it something far more cynical? And most disturbing of all, did the commanders who ordered this attack know they were sending these men to die? The planning for the Dieppe Raid began in April 1942, and from the very beginning, it was plagued by confusion, political pressure, and catastrophically flawed assumptions. Britain had been at war with Germany for nearly 3 years. The Soviet Union was desperately fighting for survival on the Eastern Front, and Stalin was screaming for the Western Allies to open a second front to relieve pressure on Soviet forces. The Americans had just entered the war and were eager for action. The British public was demoralized by years of defeats and wanted to see offensive operations. Churchill needed a victory, any victory, to show that Britain was still in the fight. But Britain wasn't ready for a major invasion of continental Europe. Everyone in high command knew this. The industrial capacity wasn't there. The landing craft technology wasn't developed. The air superiority wasn't established. So instead of a genuine second front, British planners conceived something smaller. A large-scale raid on a French port, a demonstration of Allied capability, a symbolic gesture that would satisfy political pressures without committing to full-scale invasion. The target selected was Dieppe, a coastal town in northern France with a small harbour and beaches on both sides. The official objectives were ambitious: destroy the port facilities, capture German prisoners for interrogation, seize invasion barges, test German coastal defences, hold the town for several hours, then withdraw. It sounded reasonable on paper. In reality, it was suicide. The man who would lead this operation was Major General John Hamilton Roberts, commander of the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division. Roberts was a professional soldier, but he had never commanded troops in combat. The Canadians under his command had been training in Britain for 2 years, and they were desperate to see action. Their morale was suffering from endless training exercises. Political pressure from the Canadian government demanded that Canadian forces be given a meaningful role in the war. The Dieppe Raid would give them that role, and it would destroy them. The initial plan, code-named Operation Rutter, was scheduled for early July 1942, but weather delays and German air attacks on the assembly ports forced cancellation. At that point, the operation should have been abandoned permanently. When a large-scale military operation is cancelled, security is compromised. The enemy potentially knows your intentions. Your tactical surprise is gone. Continuing with a modified plan is usually catastrophic, but Lord Louis Mountbatten, Chief of Combined Operations and the primary advocate for the raid, pushed for it to be revived. The operation was renamed Jubilee and rescheduled for the 19th of August, with some modifications, but essentially the same plan. And here is where the story gets disturbing. Multiple officers expressed serious concerns about the revised operation. Captain John Hughes, Hallett, the naval force commander, was worried about the lack of naval gunfire support. The original plan had included bombardment by battleships to suppress German defences. The revised plan eliminated this, relying instead on air support and the element of surprise. Hallett argued that attacking a heavily defended port without naval bombardment was asking for disaster. His concerns were noted and ignored. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Leigh Mallory, commanding the air component, was concerned about German fighter response. The Luftwaffe had significant forces in the region. Achieving air superiority over Dieppe for the entire operation would be difficult. If German aircraft attacked the landing forces while they were on the beaches, the casualties would be catastrophic. His concerns were noted and ignored several Canadian officers, including Brigadier William Southam, expressed reservations about the frontal assault plan. Dieppe's beaches were overlooked by high cliffs and buildings. German machine gun positions had clear fields of fire across the entire landing zone. Attacking directly into this killing ground without adequate suppression fire seemed like madness. They suggested alternative approaches, flanking maneuvers, more preliminary bombardment. Their concerns were noted and ignored. Why? Because Mountbatten and the planners at Combined Operations Headquarters believed that surprise and speed would compensate for lack of firepower. They believed that hitting the Germans fast and hard would prevent organized resistance. They believed that the Canadians' motivation and training would overcome tactical disadvantages. Every one of these beliefs was wrong. The 19th of August, 1942, 3:47 a.m., the first elements of the raiding force approached the French coast. The plan called for flanking attacks on German positions on the cliffs to the east and west of Dieppe, followed by the main assault on the town beaches. If everything went perfectly, the flanking forces would silence the German guns before the main force landed. Nothing went perfectly. The eastern flank attack, led by No. 3 Commando, ran into a German convoy at sea. A firefight erupted, completely destroying tactical surprise. The Germans on shore were now fully alerted. The western flank attack, led by No. 4 Commando under Lieutenant Colonel Lord Lovat, achieved its objectives brilliantly, destroying a German battery. But this success was isolated and couldn't influence the main battle about to unfold on Dieppe's beaches. At 5:20 a.m., the main assault force approached the beach. The Royal Regiment of Canada was landing at Puis, east of Dieppe. The South Saskatchewan Regiment was landing at Pourville, west of the town. And the Essex Scottish and Royal Hamilton Light Infantry were heading directly for Dieppe's main beach. As the landing craft approached the shore, the sun was rising, illuminating the boats perfectly for German defenders. The Germans were ready. Contrary to Allied intelligence, Dieppe was heavily defended. Machine gun positions were dug into the cliffs. Artillery was pre-registered on the beaches. Mortar teams had the landing zones mapped. As the first landing craft touched down, the Germans opened fire with everything they had. The slaughter began immediately. At Puis, the Royal Regiment of Canada landed directly into a death trap. The narrow beach was overlooked by cliffs, honeycombed with German positions. Machine guns fired down on the Canadians from three sides. Men were cut down as they exited the landing craft. Those who made it to the sea wall found themselves pinned, unable to advance or retreat. The battalion commander, Lieutenant Colonel Douglas Catto, was killed within minutes. Of 554 men who landed at Puis, 200 were killed and 264 captured. Only a handful escaped. At Pourville, the South Saskatchewan Regiment had slightly better luck. They managed to get off the beach and into the town, but they couldn't advance beyond it. German reinforcements arrived quickly, and the Canadians found themselves fighting house to house against increasing resistance. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt, their commander, displayed extraordinary courage, leading his men across a bridge under heavy fire. He would later receive the Victoria Cross, but his heroism couldn't change the fundamental problem. The operation was collapsing. On Dieppe's main beach, the disaster reached its peak. The Essex Scottish Regiment landed at 5:20 a.m. and immediately came under devastating fire. The beach was covered with large stones, making movement difficult. German machine guns on the promenade and in buildings overlooking the beach had perfect fields of fire. Men fell in waves. Those who made it across the beach found the seawall was higher than intelligence had indicated. Scaling it under fire was nearly impossible. The Royal Hamilton Light Infantry landed minutes later and met the same fate. Their commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Labat, was wounded almost immediately. The regiment scattered, with some men finding minimal cover behind disabled tanks, others pinned against the seawall, many dead or dying on the stones. And then the tanks arrived. 29 Churchill tanks of the 14th Canadian Army Tank Battalion were supposed to provide fire support and lead the advance into the town. But the intelligence about Dieppe's beaches had been catastrophically wrong. The large stones weren't just difficult for infantry to cross, they were impassable for tanks. The Churchill's tracks couldn't get traction. They bogged down, sitting targets for German anti-tank guns. Within minutes, 28 tanks were disabled or destroyed. Only one tank managed to partially penetrate into the town before being knocked out. From his headquarters ship offshore, General Roberts was receiving fragmentary and confusing reports. Radio communications were chaotic. He couldn't see the beaches clearly. He didn't understand that the entire operation had collapsed within the first 30 minutes. Based on overly optimistic initial reports, Roberts made the worst decision of the day. He committed his reserves. At 7 a.m. Les Fusiliers Mont Royal were ordered to land on the main beach to reinforce what Roberts believed was a successful assault. Instead, they landed into the same killing ground that had already destroyed 2 regiments. They were slaughtered. Of 584 men who landed, 119 were killed and 344 captured. The regiment effectively ceased to exist. By 8 a.m., the situation was undeniable even to Roberts. The attack had failed completely. The flanking forces were pinned or destroyed. The main assault on Dieppe had been repulsed with catastrophic losses. No objectives had been achieved. The port had not been captured. The tanks were destroyed. And several thousand Canadian soldiers were trapped on the beaches under continuous fire. The withdrawal order was given at 9 a.m., but executing it was nearly impossible. Landing craft had to approach beaches that were still under heavy fire to pick up survivors. Many craft were hit and sank. Men had to wade into the sea under fire, hoping to reach boats. Hundreds drowned. Hundreds more were too wounded to move and were left behind. The evacuation was chaos, with German artillery and aircraft attacking the rescue vessels. By 11 a.m., it was over. The last landing craft pulled away from Dieppe, leaving behind the dead, the wounded, and over 1,900 prisoners. The beaches were littered with bodies, destroyed equipment, and abandoned weapons. The sea was red with blood. 6 hours of combat had resulted in the near destruction of an entire division. The final butcher's bill was staggering. Of 4963 Canadian soldiers who participated, 916 were killed, 586 wounded, and 1946 captured. That is a 68% casualty rate. Entire units ceased to exist. The Royal Regiment of Canada had 94% casualties. The Essex Scottish had 95% casualties. Some companies were completely wiped out, not a single man returning to England. Naval losses were also severe. 1 destroyer sunk, 33 landing craft destroyed. RAF losses were the heaviest in a single day since the Battle of Britain. 106 aircraft destroyed. The Germans, by contrast, lost approximately 591 men and 48 aircraft. It was a massacre, pure and simple. The immediate aftermath was damage control. Churchill issued a statement calling the raid a reconnaissance in force that had achieved valuable objectives. Mountbatten claimed the operation had tested German defences and provided crucial lessons for future invasions. The Canadian government, devastated by the losses, publicly supported these explanations while privately demanding answers. But the questions wouldn't go away. What exactly had been achieved? What lessons were learned that justified 68% casualties? And most disturbingly, had the commanders known how dangerous this operation was, and sent the Canadians anyway? The official narrative, repeated for decades, was that Dieppe taught the Allies critical lessons for D-Day. Don't attack a defended port directly, use overwhelming naval and air bombardment, develop specialized equipment for beach obstacles. These lessons, the story goes, saved thousands of lives on the 6th of June, 1944, but historians have increasingly questioned this narrative. Many of the lessons supposedly learned at Dieppe were already known from earlier amphibious operations, from Gallipoli in World War I, from Norway in 1940. Experienced planners already understood that frontal assault on defended ports was suicidal. The raid didn't reveal new information so much as confirm existing knowledge at the cost of thousands of lives. So why was it really done? Several theories have emerged, some supported by declassified documents. One theory involves Soviet pressure. Stalin was desperate for a second front. The Dieppe Raid was a way to demonstrate to the Soviets that Western allies were taking offensive action, even if it wasn't a full invasion. It was a political gesture, sacrificing Canadian troops to maintain the alliance with the Soviet Union. Another theory involves intelligence operations. Some historians suggest the raid was partly designed to capture German code materials and equipment from Dieppe. Special teams were tasked with raiding specific buildings believed to contain valuable intelligence. If this was a primary objective, it was never achieved, and the cost was unconscionable. A third theory, more cynical, suggests the raid was designed to fail. By demonstrating that the Allies couldn't successfully invade France in 1942, the operation would justify delaying the Second Front that Stalin demanded. It would show the Americans who were pushing for early invasion that the challenges were greater than they realized. The casualties would be high enough to make the point, but not high enough to cripple Allied capabilities. If this theory is true, it means thousands of Canadians died to prove a political point. Whatever the true motivations, the Dieppe Raid revealed several disturbing truths about Allied command in 1942. First, political pressure was overriding military judgment. Operations were being launched not because they made military sense, but because they satisfied political and diplomatic needs. Second, intelligence failures were being ignored. Multiple sources had indicated Dieppe was more heavily defended than assumed, but these warnings were dismissed. Third, concerns from experienced officers were being overruled by commanders who had never seen combat. And fourth, Commonwealth troops, particularly Canadians, were being treated as expendable, given the most dangerous missions with inadequate support. For the Canadians who survived, Dieppe was a trauma that lasted lifetimes. Lieutenant Colonel Cecil Merritt, who won the Victoria Cross for his leadership at Pourville, spent 3 years as a POW. He never spoke publicly about Dieppe after the war. The few officers who had objected to the plan before the raid felt vindicated but devastated. They'd been right, but being right hadn't saved anyone. General Roberts, who commanded the operation, was quietly removed from command shortly after. He spent the rest of the war in administrative positions and never commanded troops in combat again. Lord Mountbatten faced some criticism, but remained in favour with Churchill and went on to other high-level commands. The planners at Combined Operations Headquarters faced no consequences. The soldiers who died at Dieppe became footnotes in the official histories, their deaths justified as necessary sacrifices for lessons learned. But here is what makes Dieppe truly haunting. In 1943, when the Allies invaded Sicily and then Italy, they used many of the same tactics that had failed at Dieppe: frontal assaults on defended beaches, inadequate naval support, over-reliance on surprise. The lessons supposedly learned at such terrible cost were being ignored. It wasn't until the planning for Normandy in 1944 that different approaches were finally adopted. And even then, many historians argue those lessons came from the Pacific Theatre and from renewed emphasis on proper planning, not specifically from Dieppe. The Dieppe Raid stands as a monument to what happens when political considerations override military reality, when commanders value perception over truth, when concerns are dismissed rather than addressed, when soldiers become pawns in diplomatic games. The 19th of August 1942 was the day 5,000 men landed on a French beach that their commanders knew was a death trap. It was the day 68% of them became casualties. It was the day the Allies learned lessons they already knew, at a price that should never have been paid. The bodies of Canadian soldiers are still buried in the Dieppe Canadian War Cemetery, overlooking the beaches where they died. Every year, ceremonies are held to honor their sacrifice. But the question remains, was it really sacrifice, or was it waste? Were they heroes who died for valuable lessons, or were they victims of a command structure that valued political expediency over their lives? The survivors of Dieppe carried that question for the rest of their lives, and 82 years later, we're still asking it.